There is a moment in history when a city that had forgotten how to feel suddenly remembered. Paris had seen thousands die. Men, women, old, young, rich, poor. The guillotine had become normal. The crowd came early. They shouted. They laughed. They demanded more blood. Death had turned into public entertainment. But one afternoon, something went wrong. 16 women stepped into the street, and instead of screaming, they began to sing. Not loud. Not wild. Not desperate. They sang like people walking into a church. The crowd waited for the fear to come. It never did. With every step toward the blade, their voices rose. Latin hymns, old hymns, words most people no longer understood, but somehow felt. When the first blade fell, the singing did not stop. It simply became quieter. One voice was gone. Then another. And still, the song continued. No one cheered. No one mocked. No one moved. These were not rebels. Not soldiers. Not politicians. They were cloistered nuns who had lived in silence for decades. Women who had never seen violence. Women whose only crime was prayer. Women who could have lived if they had said one word. No. What the crowd saw that day did not make sense. Fear was supposed to break people. Death was supposed to win. But these women walked forward as if death had no authority over them at all. By the time the last voice fell silent, Paris was no longer celebrating. It was ashamed. This is not a legend. This is not a myth. This happened. If you are ready, I will begin chapter 1, where we go back before the scaffold, before the singing, and see how 16 ordinary women became something the revolution could not destroy. Stay with us till the end for valuable insights. Like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. Before there was singing in the streets of Paris, there was silence behind stone walls. For many years, the Carmelite convent in Compiègne was a place the world forgot. Thick walls. Narrow windows. A quiet life measured not by clocks or politics, but by bells and prayer. Inside lived 16 women who had chosen to leave the noise of the world behind. Some were old. Some were young. One was only 29. None of them were famous. None of them were powerful. They woke before dawn every day. They prayed. They worked. They ate simple food. They spoke softly. Many of them had not stepped outside the convent for decades. The world beyond the walls might as well have been another planet. And then the world came crashing in. France was tearing itself apart. What had begun as a cry for freedom had turned into something darker. The revolution promised liberty and equality, but fear spread faster than hope. The government no longer trusted anyone. Enemies were everywhere, or so they claimed. A wrong word. A wrong silence. A wrong belief. Any of it could lead to death. Paris led the madness, but it did not stop there. The terror traveled outward, reaching even quiet towns like Compiègne. The revolution did not only fight kings and nobles. It went after faith itself. Churches were closed. Priests were hunted. Religious clothing became illegal. To believe in God was no longer private. It was suspicious, dangerous, criminal. For the 16 Carmelite nuns, this was a death sentence written slowly. One morning, soldiers arrived at the convent gates. There was no violence at first. No shouting. Just orders. The nuns were told they could no longer live together. They were forced out of their home. Their habits were forbidden. Their convent, once a place of peace, was taken from them. They stepped into the street carrying almost nothing. For women who had lived in silence, the outside world was overwhelming. Noise, crowds, fear hanging in the air. Some of them had entered the convent as teenagers. They had never lived like this. But they did not panic. They did not scatter. Their leader, Mother Teresa of St. Augustine, refused to let the community die quietly. She found small apartments scattered across the town. For tiny places where the sisters could live in secret. They wore plain clothes. They spoke carefully. They prayed in whispers. Every day could be the last. And yet, something strange happened. Instead of fear growing among them, clarity did. Mother Teresa gathered the sisters together one night. The room was dim. The doors were closed. She spoke calmly, without drama. She asked a question that none of them had ever considered before. If death came for them, would they accept it? Not seek it. Not chase it. But accept it, if it was demanded. Would they offer their lives, not in anger, not in protest, but as a sacrifice, hoping the bloodshed consuming France might finally end? The room went quiet. Two of the older nuns hesitated. Not because they loved life more, but because the idea was heavy. Final. Terrifying. Mother Teresa did not push them. She told them to pray. Within hours, they returned with tears in their eyes, not of fear, but of shame for doubting. They asked forgiveness. They were ready. All 16 agreed. From that night on, every morning at 4 o'clock, they renewed their vow. They did not know when death would come. They only knew they would not run. They waited. Outside, France burned. Inside, 16 women prepared their souls. They did not know how soon the knock on the door would come. Waiting can be harder than dying. For 2 long years, the 16 Carmelite nuns lived inside that waiting. Every knock on a door. Every shout in the street. Every rumor that drifted through town carried the same question: is this the end? They lived quietly, but not carelessly. They rose every morning before the sun. For a clock, always the same. Prayer came first. Not loud prayers. Not brave speeches. Just steady words spoken in low voices. Words they had spoken all their lives. Words that reminded them who they were when the world tried to tell them they were criminals. They worked during the day. Simple tasks. Sewing. Cleaning. Helping where they could without drawing attention. They moved like shadows through the town, careful not to gather too often, careful not to be noticed. And yet, people noticed them anyway. There was something different about these women. They were calm in a town full of fear. They did not argue in public. They did not curse the revolution. They did not beg for mercy. They lived as if the terror had no power over their inner lives. This kind of quiet strength made people uncomfortable. Neighbors whispered. Shopkeepers watched. In a time when the government paid rewards for information, silence could look like guilt. Faith could look like rebellion. Someone talked. No one knows exactly who it was. A neighbor. A shop owner. Someone who wanted money. Someone who wanted safety. Someone who wanted to prove loyalty to the revolution. One whisper was enough. Before dawn on June 21, 1794, soldiers broke down the door. There was no warning. No chance to hide. They searched everything. Drawers. Floors. Walls. They found prayer books. Religious medals. Letters. a small statue of the Virgin Mary. Proof that these women were still living as nuns. That was all the evidence needed. They were arrested for fanaticism, for refusing to abandon their faith, for praying. The irony was cruel. They were taken to a former convent that had been turned into a prison. The same walls that once protected women like them now held them like a cage. The air was heavy with fear. Prisoners cried. Some screamed at night. Some broke down completely, shaking and begging guards for mercy that never came. The Carmelites did not change. They continued their routine. 4 o'clock prayers, quiet hymns, calm voices. They comforted others. They listened. They held hands with strangers who were certain they would die. Other prisoners noticed. English Benedictine nuns imprisoned in the same building later wrote about them. They said the Carmelites looked like women preparing for a wedding, not an execution. Their peace did not make sense. On July 12, guards came with orders. The nuns were to be transferred to Paris for trial. There was a problem. Their civilian clothes were being washed. So the guards loaded them into carts wearing their religious habits, the very clothing that had been outlawed. The journey took hours. The streets were full. People shouted insults. Some laughed. Some cursed. The Carmelites sang. Not loudly. Not angrily. Hymns carried over the noise of the crowd. Old melodies. Steady voices. People stared. They had seen prisoners cry. They had seen prisoners beg. They had never seen prisoners sing. By the time the carts reached Paris, something had already shifted. These women were no longer invisible. The revolution had wanted silence. Instead, it was getting a song. Paris did not welcome the 16 women with curiosity or mercy. Paris welcomed them with indifference. By the summer of 1794, the city was tired of death, but not finished with it. Executions happened every day. Sometimes dozens in a single afternoon. The guillotine worked like a machine. People came. People watched. People went home. Fear had become routine. The Carmelite nuns were taken to the prison where many waited only days, or hours, before dying. The building was crowded. The air smelled of sweat and despair. Some prisoners whispered prayers. Others stared at walls, already broken inside. The Carmelites stood together. When the day of the trial came, there was no sense of suspense. Everyone in that room already knew the ending. Revolutionary trials were not about truth. They were about speed. Guilt was assumed. The courtroom was just a stage. The prosecutor was a man who had sent hundreds to their deaths without hesitation. He did not shout. He did not rage. He spoke as if reading a list of items to be cleared away. The charges were read. Fanaticism. Conspiracy. Hiding weapons. Supporting enemies of the Republic. The last charge was almost absurd. The only weapons found were prayer books, rosaries, medals, and a small statue of the Virgin Mary. Objects that had brought comfort were now treated as threats. The nuns listened quietly. Then something unexpected happened. When the word fanaticism was spoken, Mother Teresa of St. Augustine stepped forward. The room froze. Defendants did not interrupt. Not if they wanted to live. But she spoke anyway. Her voice was calm. Please explain what you mean by that word. The prosecutor looked at her with annoyance. He explained that fanaticism meant childish beliefs, foolish religious practices, dangerous attachments to God. Everyone waited for her to apologize, to explain, to beg. She smiled. Not a nervous smile. Not a mocking one. A peaceful smile. If that is what fanaticism means, she said, then yes. We are guilty. A murmur passed through the room. Then came the question that mattered. One by one, each nun was asked the same thing. Would you renounce your vows? Would you deny your faith? Would you swear loyalty to the Republic? It was their last chance. One word could save them. Constance, the youngest, answered first. No. An older sister answered next. No. Another. No. 16 times, the same answer. No anger. No speeches. No hesitation. Just no. The verdict was announced quickly. Death. All 16. Something strange happened then. The nuns did not cry. They did not fall apart. They did not curse the men who had condemned them. Right there in the courtroom, they renewed their religious vows together. Words spoken years earlier in peace were spoken again in the presence of death. Then they began to sing a hymn of thanksgiving. The guards stood still. The prosecutor looked confused. This was not how trials ended. Prisoners were supposed to break. These women looked stronger than before. They were taken back to their cells to wait. They did not know they had only days left. But they sang that night, softly, as if already walking towards something they had accepted long ago. July 17, 1794. The day was heavy with heat. Paris smelled of blood and summer dust. The square where the guillotine stood had not rested in weeks. Bodies had fallen there every day. The ground was dark, sticky. The city had learned to ignore it. That afternoon, carts rolled through the streets carrying the condemned. Most prisoners cried. Some screamed. Some sat frozen, already gone inside. The crowd knew these sights well. They barely looked anymore. But when the carts carrying the 16 Carmelite nuns appeared, people noticed. They were singing. Not shouting. Not sobbing. Singing. For 3 hours, their voices carried through the streets of Paris. Hymns older than the revolution. Words the city had tried to erase. Shopkeepers stepped outside. Women leaned from windows. Children asked questions their parents could not answer. Why are they singing? Why are they not afraid? The carts reached the square. The executioner waited. He had killed thousands. He had seen everything fear could do to a human being. He had never seen this. The nuns asked permission to sing one final hymn before the executions began. The executioner agreed. Perhaps curiosity. Perhaps respect. Perhaps something else he did not understand. 16 voices rose together. Then they renewed their vows one last time. Mother Teresa spoke calmly. She announced the order. Youngest first. Oldest last. The older sisters would stay to the end, giving strength to the younger ones with their presence. Constance stepped forward. She was 29. She had spent 9 years inside the convent. The first real view of the world she ever had was this square, this scaffold, this blade. She knelt before Mother Teresa. Permission to die, Mother. Mother Teresa touched her face gently. Go, my child. Constance kissed the small statue hidden in Mother Teresa's hand. She walked to the scaffold alone. When the executioner's assistant moved to help her, she waved him away. She did not need help. She climbed the steps. positioned herself, looked once more at her sisters. She kept singing until the blade fell. Silence. Then the singing continued. 15 voices. Another sister stepped forward. Permission to die, mother. Another blessing. Another kiss. Another solitary walk. The blade fell again. 14 voices. The crowd did not move. No cheering. No insults. People who had come for entertainment stood frozen. Time seemed to slow. One by one, the ritual repeated. Each woman walked alone. Each one sang until the end. Each one refused assistance. The square no longer felt like a place of execution. It felt like something else, something no one had words for. As the voices grew fewer, the silence grew heavier. With every falling blade, the song grew thinner. 12 voices. 10 voices. 8. The executions moved quickly. Less than a minute for each life. The executioner worked as he always did, but his movements were slower now. Careful. Almost restrained. Even he seemed changed by what was happening. The crowd did not speak. These were people who had once shouted insults. People who demanded faster deaths. People who laughed while blood ran into the stones. Now they stood shoulder to shoulder, silent, as if afraid that a single sound might shatter something fragile in the air. One of the sisters was Julie of Jesus. She had spent her life doing hard work in the convent. Cleaning. Carrying water. Cooking. She had never studied Latin deeply. She had never spoken in public. Yet she sang every hymn from memory, the same way she had sung them every day for years. Her voice was steady. Her steps were calm. She climbed the scaffold like a queen. The blade fell. Another voice disappeared. Sister by sister, the crowd watched dignity walk into death. Then came the oldest. Sister Mary of Jesus Crucified was 78 years old. She had lived through wars, hunger, and the fall of a kingdom. Her body was weak, but her eyes were clear. As she stood before the executioner, she paused. She looked at him. Not with anger. Not with fear. I forgive you with all my heart, she said quietly. And I pray God forgives you too. The executioner had heard many last words. Screams. Curses. Begging. Silence. But this stopped him. Just for a moment. Long enough for everyone to notice. She climbed the steps without help. The blade fell. Only one voice remained. Mother Teresa of St. Augustine stood alone. She had watched 15 women die. Women she had guided. Women she had loved. Women who had trusted her to the end. She had given each one permission to die. She had held the small statue they kissed. She had said, "Go, my child," again and again. Now there was no one left to bless her. She looked at the crowd. Thousands of faces. No cheers. No hatred. Just silence. Heavy and complete. She began to sing alone. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It carried across the square, across the blood-soaked ground, across the bodies of her sisters. A final hymn. A final offering. When the song ended, she climbed the scaffold. She did not rush. She did not hesitate. She looked up once. Then the blade fell. Paris did not cheer. Paris did not move. Witnesses later wrote that it was the deepest silence they had ever known. A city that had grown used to death suddenly remembered what it was doing. 16 women had turned a place of killing into a mirror. And the city did not like what it saw. The bodies were thrown into a mass grave with hundreds of others. No markers. No names. Just earth closing over flesh. The revolution wanted them forgotten. But something had broken that afternoon. People talked. Quietly. In markets. In taverns. On street corners. They spoke of the women who sang. Of how fear had failed. Of how the guillotine had taken bodies, but not meaning. 10 days later, the man who had ruled through terror would climb the same steps. And he would not sing. 10 days after the singing stopped, Paris watched another cart roll through the streets. This time, no hymns followed it. The man standing inside was Maximilien Robespierre, the architect of the terror. The voice that had signed thousands of death orders without hesitation. The man who believed fear could build a perfect society. Now fear was building something for him. He had lost power almost overnight. Allies turned away. Accusers became accused. The machine he created no longer needed him. When he reached the scaffold, witnesses said his face was twisted with panic. His jaw had been shattered during his arrest. He could not speak clearly. He could not pray. He could not sing. When the blade fell, he screamed. The reign of terror ended that day. The revolution said it was coincidence. Politics. Timing. History correcting itself. Official records never mentioned 16 nuns. Their deaths were listed like thousands of others. Numbers on paper. Bodies in a pit. But the people who stood in that square remembered. They remembered the silence. They remembered the singing. They remembered the strange shame that settled over the city like dust. Fear had ruled Paris by convincing people that survival was everything. That beliefs were disposable. That life without dignity was still life. 16 women had shown something different. They had shown that fear only controls the body. That power ends where conviction begins. That you can take everything from a person and still fail to defeat them. The mass grave where their bodies were thrown filled quickly. More victims. More names erased. The ground closed. Grass grew. Time passed. The revolution moved on. But memory did not die. Prisoners who survived told the story again and again. They described the hymns. The order. The calm. English nuns who had been imprisoned with the Carmelites kept their abandoned clothes as sacred reminders. Stained fabric became proof that something holy had passed through horror. For more than a century, the world said little. Politics made the story uncomfortable. Faith made it dangerous. Silence returned. And still, the names survived. In a quiet cemetery in Paris, hidden behind walls, the victims of the terror are buried. Most visitors do not know it exists. Trees grow there. Birds sing. Names are carved into stone. Hundreds of them. Forgotten people. Ordinary lives ended violently. Among those names are 16 that refuse to fade. Every year, on July 17th, a small group gathers. No crowds. No shouting. Candles flicker in the quiet. Voices rise softly. The same hymns. The same words. Songs once meant to be silenced. They do not sing to protest. They do not sing to accuse. They sing to remember. Because survival is not the only measure of victory. Sometimes victory is refusing to surrender who you are. Sometimes it is walking forward without hatred. Sometimes it is choosing meaning over fear. 16 women walked to their death singing, and a city that thought it had seen everything stood still. Centuries later, people still remember them. And almost no one remembers the men who killed them. That is the final truth fear never understands.